You know, when you look through Scripture, it's very obvious from the very first page of the book of Genesis, the very first chapter, that this was written to and about humankind. We're told right away that God made man in His own image and after His likeness, and the rest of the story, the rest of Scripture, is all about mankind. God's purpose for putting humans here, God's all of His reasons, the method He's going to go about in restoring what was lost because of mankind's mistakes. And all of that is in Scripture. We go from chapter to chapter through the prophets. We come to the New Testament and we see it gradually unfolding before our eyes as the story is told. The story of man. And where God's ultimate destiny, the destiny He has in mind for us, will wind up being. So we see all of that, and yet as we read along, we from time to time run across little items. You say, wait a minute, what is that? What are we talking about here when we talk about cherubim? Just out of the blue, it's mention of cherubim, the cherubim, like you're supposed to know what that is. Well, you haven't told me what that is. You haven't even told me anything about having made those, and yet here they are. And you find that there are these beings, obviously beings, that sometimes they're described as men. You know, the man Gabriel, for example. And they appear to the people of God in various places, some of the prophets in some cases, like Daniel and others. And then we say, well, who is this as the man Gabriel? And yet when you read the description of this man Gabriel, it is very clearly that that's not a man you're talking about. Has the appearance of a man in some way, but it's not really a human being. In fact, he refers to a human being he's talking to as mortal, mortal man. Obviously, he's not one of them. So what you see here in Scripture, as you read through it, even though it's the story of humankind and God's dealing with man, nevertheless, we pick up little nuggets, little bits and pieces here and there, and we begin to see that mankind is not the only world, the world of mankind that is, not the only world God has made. That there is another world, if you want to call it a world. I like to think of it as another dimension of reality. Being a Trekkie, a Star Wars fan, I think in those terms. A science fiction buff, I think in terms of other dimensions of reality. And I think that's a better way of thinking of it than the way the ancients might have thought of these things. So you have this extra dimensional reality there, and these beings, these entities, obviously intelligent entities that dwell in that other realm and that interact with our realm. Now, we can't just interact with them at will, but they can interact with us. And then we begin to understand as we continue through Scripture that that's what they were made for, to interact with us. They are ministers, that is to say, they are servants to us. They minister to the heirs of salvation. And so we see these ministers to the heirs of salvation at work throughout Scriptures, and we begin to see also that they're very powerful. They can do incredible things you and I cannot imagine. Again, things you and I only see in the world of science fiction. But this is not fiction. The Bible presents this as reality. So there is very clearly a spirit realm. Now I'd like to go to Daniel, the 10th chapter, and show you how this interaction with a particular spirit being here. And we see he's had interactions before. For example, in chapter 9, the man Gabriel, who turns out not to be a man at all, appears to him. Chapter 10, he has another encounter, and we're told why he has the encounter, and then we see other things revealed along the way, and what this has to do with the unfolding events that will ultimately lead to the second coming of Jesus Christ and the establishment of the kingdom of God on this earth. In chapter 10, let's just begin there in verse 1. I'm reading from a different translation this time. I suppose it was because last time I was so rattled from the music starting before the end of the sermon that I left my Bible here. Not really, but I did. I left the Bible here, so I'm using a different translation. This one is a little bit, I would say, in certain key places, and I'll point them out as I get to them, are not the best translation. This is not my favorite translation. It's the New Revised Standard Version. I prefer the older one to the new one. And then they understand that there is a revision of this one, and it's even worse. Not saying this is bad, I'm just saying it's not my favorite and it's not the best. But I'll be reading from that today, and it's just fine. It's just that I'll point out some things as we move along, because I don't think it always translates in the best way. Chapter 10, in the year of King Cyrus of Persia, verse 1, a word was revealed to Daniel, who was named Belteshazzar. The word was true, and it concerned a great conflict. Now he's going to describe what that conflict was, or the nature of the conflict, in chapter 11. And then he's going to move on to something else in chapter 12. But the entirety of chapter 10 is a big build-up for chapter 11, for the things that are revealed there concerning this great conflict, and some of the key players, and particularly one key player who then turns up in this particular message that he got from this individual. We'll read on down to it and see what that's all about. It says, he understood the word, having received understanding in the vision. So he's had these visions. He's had a series of visions, as you know, and this is one of them. And he goes on to describe what happened leading up to this point. But before we get there, I want to call your attention to the fact that this is the 3rd year of King Cyrus of Persia. That means that, we know what happened in the 3rd year of King Cyrus. The first wave of people who had been in the exile returned to the land. Daniel was not among them. He wasn't there. He was still in exile. But the first ones, under Cyrus, remember, it was prophesied that under King Cyrus, that the people would return from the 70 years of Babylonian captivity. And so that first group is already gone. They're going back, or have gone back to the land. And now Daniel here, still in exile, seems to be all concerned about something. Well, let's just read on down through it. Verse 2, at that time I, Daniel, had been mourning for 3 weeks. What's he mourning about? I had eaten no rich food, no meat or wine had entered my mouth, and I had not anointed myself at all for the full 3 weeks. So he was fasting, at least probably what we would call a modified fast, but a fast nevertheless. He was in mourning and he was fasting, and this is what you see many examples. Well, you see many examples of this in Scripture. Verse 4, and obviously this was accompanied with prayer. He was seeking God's help, God's assistance in something. On the 24th day of the first month, I was standing on the bank of the great river, that is the Tigris. I looked up and saw a man clothed in linen with a belt of gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like beryl, his face like lightning, his eyes. Notice that I looked up and saw a man, and yet read the description of this man that he saw. He said his body was like beryl, his face was like lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and the sound of his words like the roar of a multitude. I, Daniel, alone saw the vision. The people who were with me did not see the vision, though a great trembling fell upon them, and they fled and hid themselves. They didn't know what was going on, but whatever it was not good. So they left. So I was left alone to see this great vision. My strength left me, and my complexion grew deathly pale, and I retained no strength. Then I heard the sound of the words, and when I heard the sound of the words, I fell into a trance, face to the ground. But then a hand touched me and roused me to my hands and knees. He said to me, Daniel, greatly beloved, pay attention to the words that I am going to speak to you. Stand on your feet, for I have now been sent to you. So this is obviously, even though he describes him as a man because he had somewhat of a man-like appearance, and yet when you read this description, this is not a man, not a human. This is one of those beings from that other realm. And he has now been sent to Daniel. Remember, Daniel's been fasting and obviously praying. He's seeking something. He's seeking God's help in something. So while he was speaking this word to me, I stood up trembling. He said to me, "Do not fear, Daniel, for from the very first day that you set your mind to gain understanding," the first of those 21 days that you've been fasting, from the very first day you did this, and to humble yourself before your God, your words have been heard. So it's not that they're just now being heard. You've been heard from the very beginning. "And I have come because of your words." Now, why didn't he come sooner? Well, he tells us why right here. "But the prince of the kingdom of Persia opposed me 21 days. So he was about to leave with this message for Daniel, but this prince of the kingdom of Persia. I didn't know human princes were that powerful that they could oppose a being like this and cause them to stay back for those 21 days. Well, the reason, of course, is for this, or the obvious answer to that dilemma, is that the prince of the kingdom of Persia was not a human being. We're not talking about a king or a prince, a human king or prince. This is one of those beings, and this one was opposing the one sent to Daniel, opposed him for 21 days. In other words, there was a war going on in this other realm, this extra-dimensional realm. So Michael, that's a name that begins to appear. It appears again in the New Testament. Michael, one of the chief princes. Very clearly, this is not talking about a human being. He's called elsewhere Michael the Archangel. Came to help me, and I left him there with the prince of the kingdom of Persia, and have come to help you understand what is to happen to your people. That's those Jews, the kingdom of Judah, the people of Judah who had been taken captivity, now had been in captivity for almost 70 years, and the first wave was now going back to the land. He said, "I've come for you to understand what is to happen to your people at the end of days. For there is a further vision for those days." Now, when it says the end of days, it can be taken to be the very end or the end of a particular era of time. And in this case, he kind of has both in view, as we shall see. But the point here, what he's getting at here, the reason Daniel was distressed somewhat, the reason he was mourning and had gone before God in fasting and prayer, is because of this very event that was taking place. The people were now beginning to go back to the land, and as God had promised, after 70 years, he would have them resettle under Cyrus in the land of promise, and they would reestablish themselves. They would rebuild the temple, restore worship, and all of that. So why you think, Daniel, why is he not rejoicing and say, "Wow, when do I get to go?" You think he'd be praying because he wanted to go. Get me on out of here. No, he was concerned because he was one of those people. He knew them. And he was concerned because he feared that once they got out of there, once they went back, that they would begin to do the same things all over again, and once again fall under the wrath of God, and once again go into exile. And so this angelic being, this extra-dimensional being appears to him, is sent to him to explain to him things that are going to happen in the days ahead. In fact, he goes into some of the centuries ahead, all the way down to the 2nd century BC, and then you see that he makes a leap across history and takes us all the way out to the end. We'll talk about that when we get there. So that's what's going on here. And he goes on to describe it further. While he's speaking these words to me, I turned my face toward the ground and was speechless. I won't go through all of this, but let's just drop on down to verse 20. Then he said, "Do you know why I have come to you? Now I must return to fight against the prince of Persia." This war still going on, this fight still going on. I got to go back and fight this other prince, this other extra-dimensional being. And when I am through with him, the prince of Greece will come. Now keep in mind what's going on here. This is in the time of King Cyrus of Persia. This being here is fighting with the Prince of Persia. He's called the Prince of Persia because for some reason he is associated with the kingdom of Persia. Now it says, once I'm through with him, once my job in dealing with him is finished, then the Prince of Greece will come. What's he talking about? Who came after the Persian Empire? Who was the guy who came across blitzkrieg style and spread his empire across the world, known for his military expertise, wielding the sword, bringing his armies in and just overtaking people? Alexander the Great. Alexander. He established the Grecian Empire. So what you have going on here is you have things going on in this world being manipulated, controlled, and so on, being at least also in association with what's happening here. Something in the background, in this other realm, is taking place. So history is being guided, and you have these other beings, some good, some not so good, in the backdrop, working to bring things about in a certain way so as to bring history to a certain direction. Apparently you have some working against that. So now you have Michael, Gabriel, and others working against these other princes because they want to stop the progress of what's going on. So they're dealing with them. Now, where did all this begin? Let me pause here. We'll continue on in just a little bit. But for some of the answers, maybe we find something in Deuteronomy chapter 32. Deuteronomy chapter 32. And in this case, I think this particular translation probably does capture the intended meaning, whereas in your King James Version, it may not. But here's the way it is. Let's just take up the account in verse 8. It says, when the Most High appointed the nations, when he divided humankind, he's talking about the Tower of Babel, what happened there. He fixed the boundaries of the peoples, now notice this, according to the number of the gods. Now some translations may say children of Israel. That doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? What do you mean, according to the number of Israel? According to the number of the gods, or the Elohim. Who are the gods? You're not talking about idols, are you? No, you're talking about Elohim is the Hebrew word, Elohim. And what does that mean? Well, it can refer to the Most High God, the Creator God, but it can refer to other beings as well. This is referring, no doubt, to other beings. And what is it saying? He appointed the boundary of the nations according to the number of the Elohim, these extra-dimensional beings, the Lord's own portion of his people, Jacob his allotted share. So apparently, and of course there's some ambiguity here, obviously, but apparently what God did when he divided the nations was that he assigned these extra-dimensional beings to those nations. And it would seem that somewhere along the way, that some of them, having free moral agency, like you and I do, went wrong, just as Lucifer had done before. They went the wrong path. That would seem to be what is going on here. At least that is a theory, and I think it's a plausible theory. But in any case, you do find these Elohim who were appointed or some way associated with the various nations, apparently originally as guardians over them to keep things moving in a certain direction. Now you have some of the Elohim, some of those angelic or extra-dimensional beings who are now moving things in a way God did not intend, and so you have this war going on behind the scenes in world history. You know, you'd like a chapter that spells all of that out for you, but you have to pick it up bit by bit, piece by piece, and kind of link it together and say, well, this is apparently what is going on here. But it's very clear that Daniel is communicating with an I almost said extraterrestrial. In one way you can say that. But an extra-dimensional being, a being from the other dimension of reality. And he's telling him that he is doing battle with other such beings in that other realm. in bringing about certain events on the earth. So he goes on to say again in verse 21, back in Daniel chapter 10, verse 21, "But I am to tell you that what is inscribed in the book of truth, there is no one with me who contends against these princes except Michael, your prince." So Michael is the prince of this people. What people? Well, Daniel and his people, the ones who are now beginning to go back to the land. So Michael is their prince. And you'll see later that there comes a time when Michael stands up, or he arises, meaning he takes action in defense of those people. Now it continues on. Like I said, this is all a big build-up. It's a build-up. Daniel didn't really have to tell us all these details, but he did, because it just emphasizes the importance of the chapter that's about to follow here, and all the information that is revealed there. And it deals primarily with two kingdoms. Well, it deals with the Persians and the Grecians, primarily with the Persians, with the Grecians, and then pretty soon into the instruction, pretty soon into the prophecy, I should say, you find a description of Alexander. You see it in chapter 11. Let's just look at start in verse 2 there. It says, "Now I will announce the truth to you. 3 more kings shall arise in Persia. The 4th shall be far richer than all of them. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. Then a warrior king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and take action as he pleases. And while still rising in power, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven." You know who this is talking about. It's referring to a Grecian king, Alexander the Great. And when he was in the height of his power, he's not called the Great for no reason. Alexander the Great, the greatness of his power, his military expertise he's quite famous for that. But when he's in the height of his power, then all of a sudden, he's cut off. He dies. There's different opinions as to exactly how that happened. I don't know for sure, but he dies relatively young. And usually when you have a king like that, a warrior king especially, and when he suddenly is out of the picture, then things often fragment. That's what often happens. And so that's what happened here. The 4 generals under Alexander carved up the Grecian kingdom into 4 kingdoms, the Grecian Empire into 4 kingdoms. And now the rest of the chapter focuses not on all 4, but only 2. The one in the north called simply the king of the north, and the one in the south called the king of the south. King of the north are those Syrian kings. And that takes in also the Holy Land. They're the ones who control the Holy Land. And then the king of the south, the Ptolemies. They were in Egypt. And there was always this tension between the two, the king of the north and the king of the south. And if you read through this whole thing, we're not going to read through it, but if you read through it, you will see that it identifies these various kings that would arise. And remember, this is in Daniel's future. Quite a ways down in the future. It identifies them. For example, Ptolemy in verses 5 through 10 deals with the king of the north. It deals with the king of the north is Antiochus II, who reigned from 262 to 246 BC, and the king of the south during that time is Ptolemy III of Egypt. And then in verses 11 through 19, the king of the south is Ptolemy IV. And the king of the north is Antiochus III. And you have even mention of a famous woman here. It says, he shall give him, he's talking about Antiochus III, giving to Ptolemy V. He, Antiochus III, will give to him, Ptolemy V, a woman in marriage, but it shall not succeed or be to his advantage. Afterward he shall turn to the coastlands and shall capture many. Who was that woman? I'll bet you could guess. Cleopatra. Cleopatra. That's her right there. Now this is well on out in Daniel's future. And then he goes on to describe these Ptolemies, the Ptolemies and the Antiochian kings, or the Syrian kings, and the tensions between them. And he does all of this is in the backdrop because he wants to focus primarily. The rest of the chapter is taken up with description and the activities of one of those Syrian kings. It's Antiochus IV, also known as Epiphanes. Do you know what Epiphanes means? Why they give him the title Epiphanes? The expression means God made manifest. This is the really bad dude here. Of all of them, he's the worst. He's the vilest of the Syrian kings. And he is the one, at a certain point in time, was determined to turn Jerusalem into a Jewish cemetery. He's going to destroy these people. He is the one who burnt swine's flesh, offered swine's flesh on the offering of burnt offerings in the temple, thus desecrating the temple. He is the one who built an altar there to Zeus, the chief of the gods. He was not a favorite of the Jewish people, I can tell you. He was not at all. And he is the one, of course, famous for during the time of the Maccabean revolt, when Judas Maccabees and his men revolted against what was going on and ultimately won. And all of this is referred to here. In fact, it says in verse 31, forces sent by him shall occupy and profane the temple and fortress. They shall abolish the regular burnt offering and set up the abomination that makes desolate. That would be that altar to Zeus, and the fact that he desecrated the temple. He shall seduce with intrigue those who violate the covenant, but the people who are loyal to their God shall stand firm and take action. That would be the Maccabees and their people, the people associated in this revolt against what was going on. The wise among the people shall give understanding to many. For some days, however, they shall fall by the sword and flame and suffer captivity and plunder. And they did. There were many martyrs in that time. When they fall victim, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join them insincerely. Some of the wise shall fall so that they may be refined, purified, and cleansed until the time of the end, for there is still an interval until the time appointed. So in the Maccabean revolt, what this tells us in history, it tells us that there was always, as we have emphasized in the past, a remnant in the land. Even though people were caving in and giving in to what was going on, they were fearful. Some of them were, they were just giving in to whatever Antiochus wanted done, or whatever their overlords wanted done. But the Maccabees said no. So there was a remnant in the land even at that time. And I believe, by the way, there's a remnant in the land today, in the land of Israel. The land where all the trouble is now today, that we hear about every day in the news. There's a remnant in the land. And that means not only, in today's terms, not only people who are turning to Messiah, Jews who are coming to faith in the Messiah, understanding that Jesus, or Yeshua as they prefer to call him, is the Messiah, but also people, many of them, who are of such mind that they would, if he were to appear, they would receive him if they had the evidence before them, and if he did appear, they would be ready to receive him. So there's a remnant still in the land. Goes on to describe Antiochus IV here. In fact, his description takes place throughout this whole chapter. The rest of the chapter, it talks about him and the things he did and his ultimate fate. But it says in verse 36, says, the king shall act as he pleases. He shall exalt himself and consider himself greater than any god, and shall speak horrendous things against the God of gods, which he did. He shall prosper until the period of wrath is completed, for what is determined shall be done. He shall pay no respect to the gods of his ancestors, or to the one beloved by women. He shall pay no respect to any other god, for he shall consider himself greater than all. That's Antiochus Epiphanes. Again, the word Epiphanes, God made manifest. He says, you want to see God? Look at me. This is a type of the ultimate end-time Antichrist. That man of sin that will arise in the end when the restrainer of lawlessness is removed, which I believe the restrainer of lawlessness, I think there are multiple restrainers, and guess who I think they are? These entities at work behind the scenes. And once they're called in, then lawlessness will reign. And then when lawlessness reigns, then this man of sin will appear and usher in the time of the end, and then Christ will come. But this guy here, Antiochus IV, is a type of the Antichrist. And it mentions, you may have noticed here, it mentions the abomination of desolation. And Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, and there's a parenthesis in the text, it says, let the reader understand. What does that mean? You see, Jesus is talking about something future to himself, and yet he is completely aware that this refers to something that happened back in the 2nd century BC. So when it says, let the reader understand, is the way it's worded, let the reader understand, what he's saying is, go back and read this, go back and understand this, and that will tell you something about the future event that will happen. You'll see the same thing happening again, in other words. So that's what that is all about. So he takes us on up to the time of the end of all of this, and as I say, through the rest of the chapter there, he talks about it. And then we come to chapter 12. Now, chapter 12, it is acknowledged by everybody, all the commentators, that something changes here. Some of the liberal commentators, those who don't really take this as the Word of God, say, well, Daniel must have lived in the 2nd century BC because he gets all these details right. He's got it. He knows the history. He knows what's been going on. He knows all about Antiochus Epiphanes, his predecessors, and the people involved in the reign of the Syrian kings as well as the Ptolemies. So he knows all of these things, but then he's trying to predict what's going to happen next, and he gets it wrong. Because he's only telling us history so far. But no, Daniel lived long before all of this. He said all of this is in his future. All the reign of the Syrian kings, the Ptolemies, and so on, all of this is in his future. But now in chapter 12, what happens here is, and we've talked about this before, you see it throughout the prophets, when they're talking about certain events, usually things near at hand, things going on at the time, and that will continue to be happening in the next years ahead. Sometimes we have all of a sudden a depiction of something in the distant future. It's called telescoping. The prophet will, or God through the prophet, will telescope to the very end of the matter. That, okay, this is what's going on, or this is what will happen, but yet there's a better outcome. Here it is. It telescopes to the end. And basically that's what you have going on here. In other words, as this extra dimensional being is describing all this to Daniel, they engage the warp drive, jump into hyperspace, slingshot around the sun, and end up in some other place, if you want to put it into modern science fiction terms. So they end up someplace else, and it's way far distant in the future from the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. So Daniel didn't get it wrong, it's just that he's taken a giant step across history because this is the vision been told to him. So let's look at chapter 12 there. At that time, Michael, the great prince, the protector of your people, there it is, the protector of your people shall arise. There shall be a time of anguish such as has never occurred since nations first came into existence. Just to pause here before we continue, have you ever wondered whether or not these things are still going on? It's just that we're not aware of them. That these things, that these beings are at work behind the scenes, that this warfare is still happening. Why would we think otherwise? Why would it have stopped? I think it is happening, and I do think that some of the things we see in the world today involves those beings. You look at the history of the Holy Land, and look at the recent history going back to 1948, you know, the common story is out there is that in 1948 these Jews moved in and established themselves as a nation, called themselves the Nation of Israel, and they drove the Arabs who were already there out. So the Palestinians were driven out by these Jews. And everybody says, well, that ain't right. They drove them out. And then in response to that, the Arabs, the League of Nations, several Arab nations, Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, and others, joined together to fight the Israelis. So these people have their land back. The only problem with that narrative is it's fiction. It didn't happen. It never happened. What happened was when Israel rightfully was established as a nation, because the land first the Ottomans had control of it. They ceded the land to the League of Nations, assigned Britain to. They had the Balfour Declaration, which their intent was to establish a Jewish homeland there. They had a right to do it because this land had been ceded to them. And then when all that when all that began to take place, 1948 takes place, Israel becomes officially a nation, and what happens is this League of Nations, the League of Arab Nations, sends word to the people, the Arabs dwelling in the Holy Land, said you need to move out, go to some of the neighboring countries, so that you don't get in the way of our machine gun fire. We're going to come in and drive Israel into the sea. So it was not the Israelis who drove them out. It was the League of Arab Nations who requested that they leave so that they wouldn't be in the way, or some of them would join them in the fight. And they voluntarily left. So no, the Israelis didn't drive them out of the land and take over their land. It didn't happen. Now once the big plan failed and Israel won, what happens when you win a battle? What has happened historically when when you have an aggressor and then you have the other person being attacked and then they return fire, they begin to respond, and they beat back the enemy, they push him back, they win, and guess what they take when they win? Land. They take what? The hill. They take land. What happened to Germany after World War II? What was for 1,000 years German land is now Polish land. What was since time immemorial German land was at that time Soviet property. Nobody questioned that because they were the aggressors, and the people they attacked pushed back and they took land. So that's what the Israelis did. And you know what? They keep giving back land though. And when they give back the land, you know what happens? They establish places from which they can launch terrorist attacks on them. That's what happens. So anyway, in 1948 you would think this many nations coming against a little pipsqueak of a nation would win, but they didn't. I have to ask the question, why didn't they? Why didn't they? I think they were better equipped. Why didn't they win? Could it be that Michael stood up? Maybe so. Maybe so. You know, I can't say things dogmatically, but it makes sense to me that these beings that are at work behind the scenes intervened, because, you know, God giving the direction, of course, and brought that about. And then you come on out to 1967. You know what happened then when, if you know your history of that, when Sadat and his Egyptian forces, with the superior armory that they received from the Soviet Union, were going to go in and take the land. That's the 6-Day War. Going to go in and take over the land. And then Brezhnev in the Soviet Union reported after that at some point that Sadat called him twice in the middle of the night. Help me, you know, need some help over here. What's going on? So can you send troops? Send some of your own troops over here to help us. No, I won't. And the reason he wouldn't, of course, is because, number one, that would not set well with the Russian people. And number two, it wouldn't help their position in the world at that time. So there are reasons he refused to help. They had been supporting Egypt in this effort, but they were supplying them with artillery and so forth. And he told Sadat, said, look, we have given you our best stuff, better stuff than we were able to supply in the war in Vietnam. Better things, better equipment. And you still can't beat them? No, we can't. So of course he changed the strategy. So here they had the best equipment. They went against this little nation, and to use a popular expression or a variation of it, they got their backsides handed to them. And then again in 1973, the Yom Kippur War. They keep winning against the odds. And I have to wonder if it just may be that there is a remnant in the land, a remnant of people who will be ready to receive Christ when he comes, ready to meet him at his return, because what did Christ say? You will not see me again until such a time, until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So I think there is a remnant in the land, and a remnant that will be there when Christ returns, as Zechariah 13:14 tells us. That's another story. But anyway, that's just an aside note as we move through this. But in chapter 12, back in chapter 12, it says, at that time Michael the great prince, the protector of your people, shall arise, or stand up, as it says in some translations. There shall be a time of anguish such as has never occurred since nations first came into existence. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth. This is why I say this didn't happen in the Maccabean revolt. This didn't happen in the 2nd century BC. He obviously is telescoping across history and looking at a distant time. This is the ultimate outcome, in other words, of all of this. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some, at some point, to shame and everlasting contempt. He's not trying to give you a step-by-step sequence. He's just saying these are things future. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, keep the word secret and the book sealed until the time of the end. Many shall be running back and forth, and this translation is different, and evil shall increase. Some says knowledge, right? Yours probably says knowledge shall increase. Now either one kind of makes sense. I can understand how evil will increase, because I think we've seen an increase of evil around the world in our time, haven't we? So it's not surprising that evil would increase. But in the Hebrew, now this is based on a Greek translation, but the Hebrew literally means knowledge. That's why the King James Version and others say knowledge shall increase. Now what does that mean exactly? Some people say, well, yeah, let's look at our technological age. Look, we have these little devices we carry in our pockets that can a lot better than the communicators they had on Star Trek. We have these little things, we can look up anything. Think of all the things you can do with that little gadget. Everybody has one now. We have all this technology. That's not what it's talking about. Not what it's talking about. Notice what he just has said. He says, keep the word secret and the book sealed until the time of the end. The book is sealed until the time of the end. What does that mean? He's telling Daniel, because Daniel, when he hears all of this, from this extra-dimensional being, all these things being described, the king of the north and the king of the south and all that, he doesn't get the picture, because this is way after his time. He may recognize some of the nations that are mentioned here. He may recognize some of the peoples that are not yet nations. are not known to be nations. He doesn't know who these 4 generals are. He doesn't know who Cleopatra is. He can't identify this. What this is saying, that the time will come when these things happen, then knowledge will be increased. That is to say, people will see what it's all about. And today we see what this is about, don't we? We can name these people, the ones who are named here. The various Syrian kings, as well as the Ptolemies. Even identify Cleopatra and several other. If we went through the whole chapter, you could see several others are identified here. Actual historical figures and historical events. And so when it says, many shall go to and fro, in other words, a lot of time passes, people do their day-to-day things, they go to, they go fro. But eventually, knowledge of these things that are presently sealed in the time of Daniel will be known. And today we look at this and we know exactly what it means, don't we? So to me, that's a pretty good indicator that we're at least moving in the direction toward the time when it'll all be over, and when finally the day that we long for will arise, when this mortal body will put on immortality. And that's what he's talking about here in chapter 12. In other words, that is the final outcome of these things. And he goes on, we won't read the rest of it, but I'd like to, from what we see from this, I'd like to go over to Revelation chapter 12. Revelation chapter 12. And maybe the music won't start. We'll move on through this pretty quickly. If you weren't here last time I was here, you won't know what I'm talking about. But if you were, you do know. And Johnny had to shut me down. Just kidding. In chapter 12, I'll just summarize it for you. You know what happens here. This woman clothed with the sun, moon under her feet, crown of 12 stars, and this great dragon standing before her because she's about to deliver a child. And he's waiting for the delivery of the child so he can consume the child when it's born. Okay, you see, the great dragon is identified later as Satan the devil. That's one of those extra-dimensional beings, isn't it? He's the chief of the extra-dimensional beings on the bad side, you might say. Or shall we say, the dark side. But in any case, he's ready to devour this child. Clearly, the child is Christ. The woman is, who do you think this woman is? We know the Virgin Mary was his actual mother, but she was a member of what? What community? The remnant of Israel. The remnant. What happened to the remnant after Christ was caught up, after the Spirit came on the day of Pentecost, the Holy Spirit came? What happened to the remnant? It became the mother church. That original Jewish church, the Jerusalem church. That was the mother church. And of course, the others were scattered, but that was the original church. This was the remnant of Israel, the original New Testament church, from the day of Pentecost forward. So the woman gives birth. If you're wondering how the church could give birth to Christ, that's how. In the sense that the church already existed as the remnant. So the woman gives birth, is ready to give birth, and the devil is there ready to devour the child. And you know, you look back historically, that's exactly what happened. That's what exactly, on the historical scene, that's what happened. Herod wanted to kill the child. Who do you think was behind all that? The dragon. Using one of his agents in the world to do his dirty bidding, and of course other agents got involved then, like the angels that appeared to them, to Joseph, the angel that appeared to him in a dream, said, take your wife and go to Egypt, and so on. But you see this happening historically. This is what's going on. He goes on to say that she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations. Clearly he's talking about Christ. But her child was snatched away and taken to God and to his throne, talking about the ascension. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, so that there she can be nourished for 1,260 days. Now, what does this mean, the woman was taken into the wilderness? Do we see anything historically where this happened? Did the mother church itself, was it taken into the wilderness? And was the church nourished there for a period of time? And the answer is, yeah, that happened. That's what happened. The Jerusalem church fled in 67 A.D. before the siege of Jerusalem and before the temple was destroyed. They fled and went to Pella. That's in the wilderness. They're away from Jerusalem. And they were nourished there for a period of time. This exact number of days. It was about a 3.5 year period between the final assault on Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. It was a time of tribulation then, but they did. They fled and they were protected, received divine protection, because General Titus, the Roman general who carried out the siege, he was going to pursue them, those Jews that had fled earlier, and end the, shall we say, the Jewish problem once and for all. Because there was a Jewish problem, but it wasn't all the Jews. It was the zealots who were causing the problems. They had assassins among them, and they were murdering Romans, high officials if they could, and so on. So the zealots were causing a lot of problems. And so General Titus was going to pursue them and take care of the whole situation, as it were, and then something happened that stopped him. And he didn't complete the job. Those days were shortened. As it were. And so he did not complete the job. But keep in mind, the devil's not done. That's not the end of it, because it continues on. It says, and war broke out in heaven. We've seen that before, haven't we? War broke out in this other realm. Michael and his angels, there he is again, fought against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought back. But they were defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven, in this celestial realm. In other words, they're defeated, and now then something else. There's a transition takes place here. Something else happens as a result. It says, the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. So now then they're down here with us. Now then they are in our realm, and they're going to be active in our realm. More so, as I read this, more so than they were before. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven proclaiming, Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. So it's obvious that the time of Christ's intervention is growing close. And the accuser of our comrades, as it puts it in this translation, has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. But they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not cling to life even in the face of death. Rejoice then, you heavens, and those who dwell in them, but woe to the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you with great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. Now, what does he do when he gets down here? Once again, he goes after the woman. That tells me that there will be a remnant in Israel in that time, a remnant of believers in Israel. At least that's an interpretation I'm putting on this, an opinion, as it were. And that doesn't work. That doesn't work, because the earth swallows up the flood that he sends out of his mouth, etc., etc. So God intervenes and delivers the woman once again, as he did earlier. And what happens? You think he's done now? No, it says that now he turns his attention to the rest of her offspring. That's you. That's the rest of us. Now he goes around the world. His intention now is to destroy the rest of this woman's offspring. All that she, in a sense, the mother church gave birth to us all, in a sense. Jerusalem above, the mother of us all. Just a manner of speaking, but nevertheless, now that he fails to destroy the mother church, the woman, now he goes after her other children. Remember, the first child, her firstborn, was caught up to God. But now then the other children, that's the believers scattered around the world. And then in chapter 13, as we've talked about many times in the past, you have a description of the two agencies he uses, the two agents he uses to go after the rest of her seed. And the rest of her seed, the rest of the woman's children, her offspring, are described as those who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. That's the church. That's the people of God. And that's who he goes after. So the rest of the book is about that. Not only that form of wrath, the wrath of the devil against the people of God, what they have to face. Once again, we see a repetition, somewhat, of what happened in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes, in the days of the Maccabees, when you had faithful and you had some not so faithful, when people were tried in the fire, as it were, when the gold was tried in the fire to see where the impurities were. And so this is what you have going on in the very end. But you also have something very near to that time, perhaps overlapping with it, when there's another intervention that takes place and another kind of wrath. It's the wrath of God. It's poured out upon the ungodly, ultimately upon the agents the devil uses in pursuing the people of God. And then in chapter 19, Jesus Christ himself appears, and he treads the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of God. He brings the battle, the war, to a close. He gathers the saints and establishes the kingdom upon the earth. And of course, that's the end of the story. That's the end of the story. That's what all of this is leading to. That's the day we're looking for, the time we're looking for, when that kingdom will be established on the earth, when all the bad things, the evils we see in the world today are dealt with, when the persecution that the church experiences now and will experience in more intense ways in the future, when it'll all come to an end. When this mortal body puts on immortality, when this corruptible puts on incorruption, when we're at long last with the Lord in his kingdom forever and ever.